Hello, friends. Hello. Uh, welcome to What the Fuck Wednesdays. Today, we're covering the case of Bonnie and Clyde. It's a big case. And listen, sometimes I forget my little disclaimer, right? For anybody that's watching this after, so watching it like as a video replay, this originally aired live with live chat. So occasionally you will hear me reading chat comments and talking to people in the live chat. Don't get confused just because you can't see that, okay? So, this is a pretty big case. These two were notorious, and they were, there they are. That's Bonnie, and that is Clyde. Listen, they were American bandits who were running rampant in the first days of those early years of the Depression, and they really caught the attention of the American public, and maybe people around the world. I don't know. But even in a culture at that time of the Depression and a lot of Depression-era gangsters, such as I think it was Babyface Nelson, and, well, hello, Michaela, how are you? Bonnie and Clyde were infamous. They were infamous. And so let's get started on the case. Michaela, have you ever heard of Bonnie and Clyde in Amsterdam? Waiting to see what she has to say. Listen, they were finally gunned down by authorities 90 years ago in 1934. But I'm just curious if their reputation had made it all the way to Amsterdam. All right. Let's get started. This is a picture of Clyde Barrow. He was born Clyde Chestnut Barrow. Oh, you did? Oh, Michaela says, yeah. She said she just watched a film about them a few weeks ago. Yeah, I just watched a film about them too. I had wanted to see the one, the really famous one with Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway. Warren Beatty played Clyde and Faye Dunaway played Bonnie. But I couldn't find it unless I rented it. But then I found another one on YouTube that I actually really enjoyed. Of course, it was made much later than the Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway movie was made. But this is an interesting fact. Warren Beatty actually purchased the movie rights to make Bonnie and Clyde from Clyde's ex-sister-in-law, and we'll get to that. She had Clyde's ex-sister-in-law had written. She started writing about her adventures with them. She had been married to Clyde's brother Buck, his older brother, and Buck was killed. He was mortally wounded. He died in the hospital about 5 days later. But she was married to, Michaela says it was the film about the men who caught them. Yeah, that was probably The Highwaymen with, well, hi, Ronnie Lynn. That was probably The Highwaymen with Kevin Costner playing Frank Hamer. And Woody Harrelson was also in that, so that might have been the one. So I just watched that recently too. I had watched it a little while ago. But at any rate, Clyde's ex-sister-in-law, when she was in prison, she began to write about her exploits with the Barrow Gang, as they were sometimes known by. And She got out of prison. She got out of prison early, actually, for good behavior. And Warren Beatty, and she got married. She became like a taxi service dispatcher, and she got married. And she was also a caregiver for her father, who was ill. And she lived a really quiet life after, her wild adventures with Bonnie and Clyde and her husband. And then Warren Beatty approached her and said, I want to buy the movie rights. And so she sold him the movie rights. She didn't like the way she was portrayed in the movie. As a matter of fact, she said that the uh, the actor's portrayal of her was like a screaming horse's ass, is exactly what she said. But she remained friends with Warren Beatty until she died. So that's just an interesting little fun fact. So Clyde was born Clyde Chestnut Barrow, and he was born to a very, very loving family. Um, they were very poor. He was born in 1909. They were very, 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 very poor. He was the fifth of seven children, and his dad's name was Henry. His mom's name was Kumi, and Kumi loved her children beyond belief. There was, listen, this is one of those stories we cover a lot of these cases, right? And we hear about the abuse and the dysfunction in whoever we're talking about, normally in their childhood, right? In the home, in the family home. That's not what we heard here at all. This was a very, very, very loving and supportive household. They were just extremely poor. His dad was a tenant farmer, and Kumi, of course, was a housewife. She took care of the kids. And then what happened when Clyde was about 12 years old, they lost the farm. So when you're a tenant farmer, tenant means exactly what it means today. There's a landlord, there's a tenant. So Henry and Kumi didn't own the land that they were farming. They actually rented the land. So if crops didn't come in, not only for whatever reason, if crops didn't come in, not only did they not have anything to sell or to feed themselves, they didn't have a way to pay the landlord that actually owned the farm. So when Clyde was 12, they lost the farm, and the family ended up moving to what was called an urban slum in West Dallas. There was a lot of families living there. This was the beginning of the Depression. They were so far that they spent the first few months, actually all of them sleeping underneath their car. And if you know anything about the Great Depression, people's cars, that was often the very last thing that they owned. And so it wasn't uncommon to see places like Hooverville, right? Which was just, it was named Hooverville after President Hoover, because that's who people blamed for the Depression. They blamed the president and the banks and the railroad companies. They blamed big business, and they blamed them for not coming in and helping them. And so, if you've ever seen anything about the Great Depression, you'll see these little towns, these little communities that would crop up, and they were full of tents and shanties, lean-tos, and people's cars, because that was all they had left. They would literally pack what they couldn't pack a lot into a car, strap it to to the hood, to the roof of the car, all of that, and drive someplace. I mean, there's pictures of, during the Great Depression, of people on the side of the road, rocking chairs, strapped to the top of the car, right? So Kumi and Henry and the 7 kids would sleep underneath the car until they got enough money to buy a tent. Now, eventually, Clyde's older sister got married and bought some property. There's a picture of what it might have looked like in one of these little communities where people literally had no homes. She eventually bought some property kind of up on a hill. And by that time, Henry had kind of cobbled together kind of a little house, right? And they drug that house up to the property. And eventually, don't know how, but the human spirit is amazing. Eventually, Clyde's dad, Henry, was able to put a filling station there on that property. So that's Henry, Clyde's dad, right there in front of the Barrow filling station. But while Clyde was really close to his family, especially to his mother, that's a picture of Clyde with his mother, Kumi. Kumi was devoted to her children. They came before everything. And later we'll see that her kids came before the law. Kumi did not have a problem in covering for Clyde or Bonnie, or Buck, for that matter. She'd lie right to the law if it meant helping her children. She didn't have any gumption, any problems with that. And Clyde was very, very close. His older brother, Buck, had started to get into trouble. And Clyde began to follow suit. And the first time that Clyde was arrested was in 1926. He was 17 years old, and he had rented a car. I didn't even know you could rent cars back in 1926. But he had rented a car, and then he didn't return it when he was supposed to. And so the police got him for that, but they let him go. And the second time he was arrested was shortly after, and this was when he got caught up with his brother Buck. They had gotten a hold of some turkeys somehow, and his sister is really funny. There was a documentary on from Biography that I watched, and one of his sisters gave an interview on it, and she said somehow they had gotten in trouble for possession of these hot turkeys, she called them, and I thought that was really cute. And they got in trouble for that. The authorities, again, because Clyde was so young, they let him go. This is his older brother, Buck. Buck spent a week in prison over these stolen turkeys. Clyde tried to work some legit jobs. He did have some legitimate jobs from about 1927 to 1929, but he really enjoyed stealing cars. I mean, there's just no other way to say it. There's just no other way to say it. And in fact, when he first met Bonnie, they were only together for 2 weeks the first time before he got arrested for a stolen car again. Now, Bonnie Elizabeth Parker, she was born in Texas also. She was the second of 3 children. Clyde was born in 1909. Bonnie was born in 1910. Her father, Charles, was a bricklayer. He died when she was 4 years old. And her mother, Emma, moved herself and her 3 children back to her parents' home in a place called Cement City, which was like an industrial part of West Dallas. And there, Bonnie's mom worked as a seamstress, and she managed to get. I don't know anything about Bonnie's brother. Her there are some excerpts around from some letters from Bonnie's sister. I don't know anything about the brother. Managed to get Bonnie almost all the way through school. Bonnie was really pretty. Bonnie made it to her 2nd year in high school, and there she met Ray Thornton. And they dropped out of school. They got married in 1926, just 6 days before her 15th birthday. So, our 16th birthday, super young. But listen, this marriage had a lot of problems. Ray, he was wild. He was a drinker. He was an abusive. He was probably a cheater because he would take off for weeks at a time. And finally, Bonnie got sick of it. And one time when he came back, she threw him out. Even though she threw him out, and he later went to prison, to Eastham Prison, for bank robbery. She never divorced him. And she was, in fact, still wearing his wedding ring the day that she died. There she is again. Really, 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 I think, really, really, really pretty girl. After she kicked Ray out, she moved back home with her mom. She got, well, Michaela, yeah, it was legal to marry that young, especially if your parent gave consent. So, her mom probably gave consent. Ray Thornton was still in prison when he heard about Bonnie's death, and then he got killed trying to escape from prison in 1937. But after Bonnie kicked Ray out or left him, she moved back in with her mom. She worked as a waitress in Dallas. She was very well liked. And this is an interesting fact. One of her regular customers at this cafe where she waited tables was a guy by the name of Ted Hinton. And eventually, Ted Hinton, he started with Western Union, then he got a job at the post office, but he thought he wanted to go into politics. He eventually ended up joining the Dallas County Sheriff's Department and served as one of the members on the posse that killed Bonnie and Clyde. That's crazy to me, right? Bonnie was fascinated with Hollywood. She was fascinated with actresses. She loved to write. She loved to write poetry. And she briefly kept a diary in 1929 when she was 18, about a year before she met Clyde. And she wrote in her diary at 18 of her loneliness, her impatience with life in Dallas, and her love of photography. Now, enter Clyde. Bonnie had a friend that had, well, I've heard accounts that the friend had a broken arm, and then I've seen in movies that it was a broken leg. Hi, Trish, welcome. And Bonnie had quit her job waiting tables, and so she moved in with her friend to help her with this broken limb. Not sure which limb it was. And Clyde was on the run, and this girlfriend of Bonnie's that Bonnie was helping out and staying with, was a sometimes love interest of one of Clyde's friends. So Clyde would go by there from time to time and check on her, get something to eat. And that's how they met in West Dallas. Clyde just went over to get something to eat and check on this girlfriend of his friend. And Bonnie was in the kitchen making some hot chocolate. And according to everybody, it was almost love at first sight. Believe it or not, Bonnie was only 19 when they met, and Clyde was only 20. That's it. In 1930. They're dead 4 years later. Okay? I don't think I ever really realized how young they were before I started doing the research. I mean, I knew they were young, but I did not know that they were dead at the ages of 23 and 24. And that just kind of blew my mind. They spent 2 weeks together. It was kind of a whirlwind romance, right? They could not get enough of each other. They were together all the time. And then, remember I told you Clyde was on the run, and then Clyde got arrested again for the stolen car. And this time, Rylin says, I didn't know that. Thought they were in their 30s. That's kind of what I assumed too. I even thought mid-30s, maybe. Blew my mind that all this happened and they were dead by 23, 24. Just blew my mind. So they spent all this time together, right? But Clyde was on the run again for another stolen car, and he got arrested. This time they convicted him of auto theft, and he was sent to Eastham Prison at the age of 21. He didn't stay there for very long. That's Eastham Prison. It was not a nice place at all. Clyde was very small in stature. He wasn't even 5'7", and he was very slim, so he was not a big guy. I think that would be probably really scary. I could see how he would be easily victimized. And Eastham Prison was not a nice prison at all. The guards there were known to regularly beat and sometimes shoot prisoners to try to keep other prisoners in line. This is Ray Foltz. Ray Foltz met Clyde when they were at Eastham Prison together. Eastham Prison also was it had a labor farm that they would have the prisoners kind of go out on a chain gang and work this farm. It was just really brutal. And Ray Foltz had escaped from Eastham Prison, and then he got caught and came back, and he and Clyde met. And Ray knew that the guards, they were going to come for him because he had escaped, and he made them look bad. And sure enough, one night they come for Ray, and 2 guards, one holds him down. He's being pistol whipped. He said he's almost to the point of losing consciousness, and he looks up and he can see Clyde is behind one of the guards, and he's got his fist clenched. And Ray Foltz gave an interview much later in life, and he said he could still remember the bulging vein in Clyde's neck. And what that did was It distracted the guards. And one of the guards turned around and said, "Do you want some of this boy?" And Ray Foltz said, "Clyde never said a thing, not one word. But it was enough to distract the guards, and they left." And Ray Foltz later said that he thinks that Clyde saved his life by distracting the guards that way. Because he says, "I think I was almost dead." And that it will impress Ray Foltz. And I think Ray became kind of a protector of Clyde. It's said that he was sexually assaulted several times when he was in prison, and that at one point he took a lead pipe and he killed the guy that was assaulting him. There was another prisoner in Easton doing a life sentence at that time. He was never going to get out. And Ray Foltz went to the guy and said, "You're a lifer. You're never going to get out. And you need to say that you killed this guy. You need to take responsibility for killing this guy." And so the other prisoner did it. And Clyde went to Ray Foltz and said, "Do you know what we should do? When we get out of here, we need to get a bunch of guns. Come back here. Let all the prisoners go and shoot every one of these damn guards." Clyde had whatever else happened to him in Easton, and nothing nice ever happened in that prison. Clyde had a true hatred for authority after this. And listen, he was serving 2 years, right? Bonnie smuggled in a gun and he escaped, but he got caught. There's Ray Foltz later on in life. He got caught relatively quickly, and then he was looking at like 14 years. Bonnie is on the outside. She's missing him desperately. His mother, Kumi, and one of his sisters are trying to get a pardon. They're going to judges. They're trying to get judges to lessen his sentence. And Clyde, he's getting pretty desperate. And in the letters that Bonnie would write to him when he was in prison, she pleaded with him. She said, "Look, I never really even knew I liked you that much, let alone loved you until you were gone. And promise me when you get out that you're never going to do anything that's ever going to take you away from me again. It's too much. I can't take it." She said, this is what she said in the letter, "I want you to be a man, not a thug." Clyde's getting really desperate on the inside. He talks another prisoner into amputating a couple of his toes because he wants out of Easton. And Easton is a prison with a work farm. And he wants off of that. And the other prisoner amputates Clyde's toes the same day that his mother and sister are at the governor's office, and they get an early release for him. So he's released 6 days later on crutches, right? He goes right back to Bonnie. He tries to work some legit jobs, but here was the problem. Anytime something happened in the area, because he was really well known in Dallas by that time, by the cops, they would come to his job to ask questions. And so after that would happen 3, 4, 5, 6 times, his employer would say, "You can't have the cops around here all the time. You got to go." And so finally, this is what his sister says. Clyde's sister says, "I guess he just gave up and decided to live a life of crime after that." Right? Listen, the Great Depression is really, really, really getting to rage. There's soup lines. Finding a finding a legit job was very hard to do anyway. Finding a legit job as an ex-con with cops that come around and bother you all the time, it it just wasn't going to work. It just wasn't going to work. I mean, these are people living in those tent cities, right? Ralph Foltz gets out of prison a little bit um, after Clyde does, and they meet up because, I mean, they're good friends. They're thick as thieves, literally, right? And Bonnie's, I mean, she's not going anywhere. She loves this guy. He's out of prison. He tried to go the straight and narrow, couldn't do it. And so whatever happens, she's in it with him. Clyde gets out of prison in February of 1932, and he and Ralph Foltz, they begin to do robberies. Not big robberies, okay? Primarily, they robbed like stores and gas stations. They weren't big planners, if you will, when it came to robberies, okay? They seemed to really rob when they needed to eat and they needed gas and they had run out of money. I mean, they were risking their lives for sometimes $10, $20, $30, $40. If they got $500, that was huge. That was a huge haul for them. $500 would probably roughly be $500 in 1932 would probably roughly be maybe $11,000 or $12,000 today. That was really good money, but they were taking like $10, $20, $30. They were just little stores along the way. I heard it termed that they were more predatory robbers. So if they ran out of money, you know, it was just kind of your bad luck if you owned a store or a gas station that was around them, because you were going to get victimized. You were going to get robbed. They hadn't planned to rob you. They just happened to run out of gas and money at that time, and you were right there. So there was no rhyme or reason for them, right? But they kind of endeared themselves to the public by doing that. They weren't really out to hurt anybody, and they weren't out trying to, you know, steal $2,000-$3,000, which would be like $75,000 today. They weren't trying to do that. It appeared that they were just trying to get by. Now, when Ralph and Clyde started to do the robberies, their main goal was to collect enough money and guns to go back to Easton Prison and launch that raid. They had not forgot about that. But during a hardware store, I mean, this tells you they weren't even robbing banks. During a hardware store burglary, which listen, okay, granted, they broke into the hardware store to get some guns, but it went wrong. And Foltz and Bonnie were arrested. Clyde got away. Clyde got away the majority of the time when other people got caught. He even got away on foot a couple times, okay? Foltz, he's tried, he's convicted. Foltz goes back to Easton. Bonnie has to go chill and cool her heels for a couple months in a jail. There's Foltz, he's on his way back to prison. That's where Bonnie was kept for 2 months until a grand jury failed to indict her. That's where she was. And she spent a lot of time writing poetry when she was in there. As soon as she got out, she went and rejoined Clyde. Clyde by now had hooked up with another one of his prison buddies. And this is almost where it was a point of no return. He was with another one of his prison buddies, and they went to this shop, and the store, they knocked on the door. It was midnight. I don't know why the shopkeeper, of course, then a lot of shopkeepers lived above the shop or behind it, right? Shopkeeper gets up, lets them in. Not sure exactly what happened, but the shopkeeper was shot and killed. And the shopkeeper's wife identified Clyde as one of the shooters. So now he has a price on his head. And there's not really any going back. Because back then, they were going to put you in the electric chair. And Clyde had vowed, after what had happened to him in Easton and the things that he had said, he came out very traumatized. He had vowed that he was never, ever, ever going back to prison. And that even if he thought he was in a position where they might catch him, if they weren't going to kill him, he'd kill himself. He wasn't going back, no matter what. Just about 6 weeks later, Clyde is with a couple of his buddies, and they're drinking moonshine. This was still in the age of Prohibition, and they went to a country dance in Oklahoma. Clyde had figured out by then that it wasn't just enough to get away, but that if he crossed state lines, that he probably wouldn't be caught or convicted. So they zigzagged. You'll see that. They're going to zigzag across about 5 states. Missouri, Iowa, Oklahoma, Texas, Missouri, Iowa, Texas, Oklahoma. I'm missing one. There's another one in there. We'll find it. The guys had robbed a company, and they had taken all the payroll. Then they went and got a little liquored up on moonshine, and they went to this country dance. And 2 sheriff's deputies approached them in the parking lot because they were obviously drunk. And the sheriff's deputies weren't even thinking that it was Clyde or whoever these are. They were concerned about the fact that they were drunk, and it was during Prohibition. And so they went over there and told them, listen, we're not having that here. And Clyde and his friends pulled out some weapons, and they shot one of the deputies. And this was, even though they eventually murdered 9 law officers, this was the very first officer that they actually killed. And Clyde really knew at this point that there was no way he could turn back. There was no way he was ever going to live a normal life. There was no way he was ever going to go the straight and narrow, was probably never going to marry Bonnie, was never going to have kids, that white picket fence. That dream was over at this point. And honestly, there was really no reason for him to have shot and killed the officer. The officers just wanted the guys to leave because they were drunk. They weren't trying to arrest him. They hadn't seen the wanted poster. They didn't know anything about that. W. Now they start robbing banks, right? Uh, Clyde had a friend who he had known from the slums. His friend's name was W.D. Jones, and he was only 16 years old. And he joined up with Bonnie and Clyde on Christmas Eve in 1932. And the next day, W.D. and Clyde murder Doyle Johnson, a young family man, while just trying to steal his car. And then January 6th, just a little bit later, Barrow kills another county deputy, kills Deputy Malcolm Davis. And at this point, the count is in January. The count is 5 dead people just since April. There's Clyde on the left with another one of his prison buddies, Ray Hamilton. They robbed some banks together, stole cars together, did a lot of robberies together. And there are those states. I'm still not sure which state I'm missing. I'm missing one of them. That's for sure. In March of 1933, Clyde's brother Buck is released from prison, and Buck had got married. That's his wife, Blanche. Blanche is the one that Warren Beatty bought the movie rights from when Warren Beatty did the movie Bonnie and Clyde with Faye Dunaway. And Blanche had convinced Buck to go straight. Blanche was beautiful. Beautiful. She had met Buck before he had gone to prison. She'd stuck with him while he was in prison, and she had convinced him to go on the straight and narrow when he got out. And one thing that Buck wanted to do, what Buck told Kumi, who was Buck and Clyde's mom, he said, "Mama, I'm going to get Clyde to go straight on the straight and narrow too." So Buck and Blanche, there's Buck and Blanche visiting Buck's daughter. That's his daughter from another woman. They went and visited his little girl, and then they headed to Joplin, Missouri. And there are the brothers together. They headed to Joplin, Missouri, to an apartment there where Bonnie and Clyde were hiding out. And Buck and Blanche hid out there with him. I mean, well, they didn't hide out very good. Let's just put it this way. Blanche later says that they probably bought a case of beer a day. They had wild card drinking, booze-filled card game nights that would last to all hours of the night. Buck and Clyde would come and go at all hours of the night. They were really loud. They were really boisterous. And even though none of the neighbors confronted them, there's the picture of the apartment as it was back then. Even though none of the neighbors confronted them, one neighbor finally had enough and mentioned to a deputy that they thought that it was probably bootleggers that were hanging out in there. They had no idea that it was Bonnie and Clyde. No idea. And so the police were like, oh my God, bootleggers, right? During Prohibition. So they get 2 cars and about five guys, and they go, April 13th, they go to confront these bootleggers that were living there. And Clyde had just come back from somewhere, and Buck was letting him in through one of those garage doors down there, and was just closing the garage door when he saw the police cars pull up and said, "Oh my God, it's the coppers." Right? And so they start getting their guns. And they open fire on these cops. But they're trying to get the girls to get into the car and WD to get into the car, right? 5 of them need to get into this car, need to just forget, don't bother grabbing anything. Somehow, in all the gunfire, Blanche had a little dog named Snowball. But Snowball gets out. Blanche takes off running down the street in the midst of this gunfight, chasing her little dog. And Clyde gets behind the wheel of the car and speeds out through this gunfight. They catch up with Blanche somehow down the street, get her in the car. I don't know what happened to the dog. And I really don't know what happened to poor little Snowball. But the officers said that they probably only got 14 rounds out before Clyde, just crazy, goes barreling down the street. They didn't know what to do. W.D. Jones did get shot in the side. Clyde got hit, but a button on his suit actually deflected the bullet, and Buck got grazed by a bullet ricocheting off of the wall. That's it. That's it. Trish says, was she influenced by him then to do the murders? Trish, I think that she realized at a certain point that there was no going back. And I don't know that she was influenced to do the murders, but she had spent the 2 months. Right, Michaela? I'm with you. I hope the puppy was okay. She spent those 2 months in that really crappy little jail cell, right? And she didn't want to go back to that. She knew Clyde wasn't going back to prison. And I don't think she was so much as influenced as she was just put into the position. Look, they were living a life that wasn't going to lead to any good anywhere, right? It just wasn't going. It just wasn't going to end well. And at this point, officers had been shot and killed. So Clyde's looking at the electric chair, and who knows what would have happened to Bonnie. And I'm sure that there was a lot of discussions. Clyde wasn't shy about saying, I'm not getting taken alive. And I don't think Bonnie wanted to murder anybody. I kind of hope Clyde didn't want to murder anybody either. It wasn't like they set out and stalked people to kill them. But the life that they were living, it's almost as if the people that they killed were just collateral damage. I mean, somebody had to get shot and die with some of these escapades. It's kind of unfortunate that that didn't happen to one or both of them sooner. It's also unfortunate that Kumi managed to get Clyde's prison sentence reduced, and he was out on the street. Though he probably just would have kept on escaping prison, right? He just would have escaped and escaped and escaped until, maybe the guards would have killed him in there one day, or another officer. But I don't think that I don't think Clyde necessarily influenced Bonnie to kill anybody. It was just the way of life. It was just the way they were living. This is how they lived, in stolen cars, robbing people, and with a lot of guns. I mean, you know, if you're getting shot at, I guess, and you're in a stolen car fleeing a robbery, and there's a bunch of guns, I guess anybody would pick up a gun and shoot back, is what I'm guessing. But because I just don't get the feeling that Bonnie was kind of essentially evil. I think she was pretty gullible. She was young. Obviously, we're both young, right? And listen, like a lot of people, she didn't have a good guy radar. Okay, let's look at her first husband. He was a piece of crap. She married him, what, 5, 6 days before her 16th birthday, and then 3 years later, she meets Clyde. I don't know. Michaela says maybe Bonnie wanted to impress Clyde. I don't know. Maybe Bonnie was the first ride or die bitch. Have you heard that term? Ride or die. Maybe she was the original. Well, yeah, he wasn't. Ryland says, regardless of going to prison, it seems like he was goading people, trying to get them to kill him. Well, I mean, my God, look at his life already at 24. He wasn't going to live to be an old guy. I was shocked when I saw Ray Foltz, how old he lived to be. Right? So, listen, they get away. WD, Bonnie, Clyde, they get out of that problem, but there's an officer dead. And they rob some banks, and even though they escaped Joplin, right? The way that they escaped, they left a lot of stuff in that apartment. They left a camera. They left Buck's parole papers, which were only 3 weeks old, if you can believe it. They left a ton of weapons. There was a handwritten poem by Bonnie, and there was a bunch of undeveloped film. And this undeveloped film was really how Bonnie and Clyde became really well known to the public, because these pictures, and these are staged pictures, okay? This is Bonnie with Clyde, and they're staging these pictures of them being thugs and gangsters. And the Globe newspaper at the time printed these. And there was one picture in particular of Bonnie clenching a cigar between her teeth and a pistol in her hand. And listen, the Barrow gang, front page news across the country. All of these pictures, and these are really famous pictures of these guys, all of these pictures were found in undeveloped rolls of film that were left in that Joplin apartment when everybody made the getaway. Now, this is what's called this is what they called a tourist court, okay, back then. And this is where the gang got back together after Joplin. They split up for a little bit. And one thing that had happened is WD and Clyde and Bonnie were driving and trying to get away from another cop chase. Clyde didn't notice, that there were warning signs about a bridge being under not under development, but maybe under repairs at the time. They drove onto the bridge and the bridge snapped. The car rolled several times into the dry ravine. There was no water, it was dry. And there's conflicting accounts if either the car caught on fire or if something punctured the battery and battery acid got loose. But Bonnie's leg was horribly burned. Her legs had gotten trapped and she couldn't get out of the car. They could not get her out in time before she was horribly burned. They got help at a nearby farm, but then they had to leave when they realized that the farmer had sent somebody to call the police. And they did get Bonnie back home for a little while to have her family. They got her in there under the radar. They did that a lot. They went back home a lot and saw family, or their family, they would get messages to them and their family would meet them in fields and bring them food and clean clothes. But they got Bonnie in to get her taken care of, but she wanted to be back with Clyde. She was in an incredible amount of pain. She was on something called laudanum for the pain, and she also needed clean bandages and a kind of sulfate to help with the wounds on her leg. She never walked straight again. She had a limp. After this, they thought she was going to die. She did pull through, but she wasn't well. And when she could get up and moving around again, the three of them met back up with Buck and Blanche. Buck and Blanche were now at this place called the Red Crown Tourist Court. And the owner said that he was almost onto them right away. Okay, so across the street from all these different little cabins, there would be a cabin on each end and then two garages in the center. And so there was a court full of that. And then he had like a cafe store kind of restaurant across the way from those. And he said he was almost onto them immediately because Blanche came in and rented the cabin for 3 people. But he could see 5 people getting in and out of cars. And also Blanche would go in and buy 5 dinners, 5 breakfasts, 5 drinks. She paid for everything with coins, which is kind of strange. She didn't pay with any bills, but she paid for the cabins with coins. She paid for 5 beers with coins. She paid for 5 dinners with coins. And within a couple of days, the owner noticed that they had taped like newspapers over the windows of the cabins. It didn't seem like they were trying to stay very low key. Blanche also walked around in what kind of maybe called riding breeches or pants, jodhpurs, right? And that was way outside the norm for women back then. And listen, they said that people that had seen them around 40 years later would mention the pants that Blanche was wearing. So they weren't keeping up. They weren't keeping a very low profile at all. They were really heavily on the radar. And the owner of the tourist court had a friend that would come in. I think 12 people altogether. 9 of them were law officers. Trish asked how many people did they kill altogether. The owner of this travel court, there was a captain of the highway patrol that would go into this cafe, this restaurant quite a bit. And so the owner of the travel court mentioned it to the captain and said, this is what he did not know who they were. But he says, this is really a really weird situation. And Barrow went into town, and they were going to go purchase some bandages. Oh, and the atropine sulfate to treat Bonnie's leg, and they were going to get crackers and cheese and whatever else. And the druggist in town, this is how they really got caught here, contacted the sheriff. And all of the sheriffs had been in these 5 states. Kansas. Kansas was the other state. So it was Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, Oklahoma, and Texas. All of the sheriffs had been alerted that if anybody was to go into any pharmacies looking for this sulfate and bandages, that they needed to contact the FBI because it was indicative of a burn. And they knew that Bonnie had burned her legs terribly. And so the druggist contacted the sheriff. The sheriff called Captain Baxter, who was the friend of the owner of the travel court. And Baxter put 2 and 2 together, and Baxter and some other officers, they got a group together, including like an armored car and a Thompson machine gun, and around 11 o'clock, they descended on the cabin. There was a huge gunfight. The gang escaped, believe it or not. They did get out of there, but Buck had been shot in the head, and he had a huge head wound. There was part of his brain that was exposed. Blanche had been almost blinded by some glass that was shot out. But again, they got away. When the gang opened up gunfire onto the officers, they actually ended up hitting the horn in the armored car, and so the horn wouldn't stop going off. And apparently that was a signal to officers, if they heard the horn, officers to come out of their hiding places and to kind of converge on the cabin. And so when the horn started going off, all of the officers left their hiding places and came out into the open, which opened them up to fire. And again, Clyde gets everybody into the car, and they bust through. They come barreling out of the garage. They blow right past all the officers. And Trish goes, I thought my neighbors were bad. Yeah, I would not want to live next to these guys or rent them a room, right? They get away again. They end up at a place called Dexfield Park. It was an abandoned amusement park of some sort. And even though Buck had this horrible head wound, believe it or not, he was conscious sometimes. He was able to eat. He could talk sometimes. But they knew he was really, really sick. He had a massive head wound. He had the loss of blood was tremendous. And there were other residents. Remember, we're talking about the Depression. There were other residents who kind of camped out at this abandoned amusement park, and they noticed all the bloody bandages, and they contacted the local police officers. You can see all of the. Can you see all of the trees that are surrounding this amusement park, abandoned amusement park camp area? The officers, Buck got away too. Buck was in the car. He was shot, but WD and Clyde managed to get him into the car, and the five of them escaped. The officers surrounded. They were out in those trees. They surrounded this abandoned amusement park. And what a problem was, about 100 people that lived there were watching. And so when the officers began to come out, the gang started to fire right away, right? And Clyde, Bonnie, and WD escape on foot. They get out of there on foot with 100 people watching, surrounded by officers. Buck is shot in the back. And he's already got that head wound. He's shot in the back. There's Blanche. When she gets arrested, Buck is taken to a hospital in Iowa, and he undergoes surgery. His mom, Kumi, made it up there before he died to spend a little bit of time with him, but he died 5 days later. Blanche was sent to prison. She got 10 years. She got out after 6. Like I talked about this in the beginning. She got out after 6 years. She spent a lot of time writing about being with Bonnie and Clyde and Buck and WD. She spent a lot of time writing in prison about that. And that's who Warren Beatty bought the movie rights to Bonnie and Clyde from. He bought the movie rights from Blanche. When she got out of prison, she went to straight and narrow. She lived a really quiet life. She was a caretaker for her father, who was really ill. She became a dispatcher for a taxi company. She got married again and lived a really quiet life with her husband until he died of cancer. And then Warren Beatty tracked her down, bought the movie rights. She did not like how she was portrayed in the movie. She said she was portrayed as a screaming horse's ass. She didn't appreciate it at all, but she did stay friends with Warren Beatty for the rest of her life. January 16th, 1934, Clyde finally is going to make that run on Easton Prison. Remember, he's been wanting to break in to Easton Prison for some time. WD, by this time, realized things were going really bad, and when they went to do another robbery, WD stole a car and went and turned himself in. And this is him giving an interview, and you can see it if you go on to YouTube. WD gives an interview and says that he was kidnapped by Clyde, and he was forced to take part in all the killings and all the robbings, and that he finally was able to make his escape. And he did this because he knew that he could get the electric chair for the killing of one particular deputy. Because remember, Clyde just didn't have Bonnie. Clyde had kind of a revolving door of his old prison buddies that he would do crimes with. Remember, we had Foltz, and then there's pretty soon we're going to have Hamilton and Methvin and his brother, WD. He had a revolving door of people that he would do crimes with. And WD was trying to save his butt, right? Rhineland says, any fiction story people believe all this escapes? No, they wouldn't. If you wrote a fictional book about this and you wrote about all the escapes, somebody would put the book down halfway through and go, this isn't believable. This isn't believable at all, right? WD's trying to save his butt from the electric chair and gives this interview. on TV. He ends up going to prison, but he only got like 10 years for his part in the deputy's killing because, he claimed he was a hostage. And later, W.D. Jones, I think was his last name, later he shot to death by some jealous boyfriend. Because you see, he lived to be a pretty old guy. Either he lived to be a pretty old guy or he was like 38 there and prison was just really hard on him. But I think he lived to be a pretty old guy. But he's shot to death by some jealous boyfriend of some woman that he was trying to help. And so I guess he got it in the end. But Clyde, meanwhile, has finally made good on going to Easton Prison to do that escape. And Clyde gets several people out of the prison. One guard is shot, and two of the people that we know he got out was a Ray Hamilton and Mesvin. I can't remember his name. Mesvin, getting Mesvin, M-E-T-H-V-I-N. Getting him in was going to be the undoing of these guys. That's Mesvin right there. So Mesvin is somebody that gets out during the Easton Prison breakout, and Ray Hamilton and Clyde do a series of robberies together. Hamilton ends up getting caught again, ends up going back to prison. Mesvin makes it to his father's farm, and Bonnie and Clyde begin using the farm kind of as a temporary hideout from time to time. The farm's a little bit busy, and Mesvin's father has a lot of workers, kind of transitory workers that he hires to help work on the farm. So Bonnie and Clyde only really go there when they don't have much of a other choice, but they'll go to get, maybe overnight to get some sleep, get a little rest, clean up a little bit, maybe get a little bit of money, and then get on the road. So Bonnie and Clyde Hamilton's back in prison. Mesvin is hiding out at his dad's place. Bonnie and Clyde are on their own. This is a reenactment of this again. I could keep saying that this sealed the deal. This is what's leading to them getting caught. It was really a multitude of things, things that they did that made their path turn left a little bit, and then right a little bit, and then left a little bit, until honestly they were going to collide with law enforcement in a way that wasn't going to work out well. But Bonnie and Clyde were just the two of them for the first time in a while, and they had pulled over on the side of this road by this farm, and they were having sodas and sandwiches, just sitting on the running board of the car. And two officers it was a newly formed highway patrol, were driving along on their motorcycles and saw them and thought that maybe they needed help. And so they decided to help them, and Bonnie and Clyde killed them both. And at that point, public opinion really began to shift about them. And the governor of Texas also compiled, she had a huge reward. There was $1,000 reward for anybody that would help and lead to the capture, arrest, and conviction of Bonnie and Clyde. $1,000 back then was like $23,000, $24,000 now. During the Depression, that was a huge amount of money. These officers kind of began to form a little posse. They've had it. There's one thing cops don't like besides robbers. They do not like cop killers. And these officers began to form a posse, a main posse, and some little side posses, thinking that if they caught them, they could split the reward money amongst themselves, right? One of the officers that got approached was Frank Hamer. And Michaela, you and I were talking when you first joined earlier that you had just watched The Highwaymen. And The Highwaymen is currently, I don't know where you saw it, Michaela, but it's currently on Netflix in the United States. And it's a semi-true story about Frank Hamer. Frank Hamer was a kind of a notorious badass, if you want to know the truth. He was a former Texas Ranger, a captain. He was kind of a lone wolf, and he was retired. He was just living with his wife pretty quietly, and he got persuaded to. Oh, Michaela says in Germany, it's on Netflix too. So Hamer accepted an assignment as like a special, kind of a special honorary Texas Highway Patrol officer, and he took it upon himself to hunt down the Barrow gang, and he relied on his training as a former Texas Ranger to do this. It only took him 102 days to track them down and figure out how to catch them in his snare, in his trap. And this is what happened. He somehow found out about Methvin, right? Well, he knew Methvin had escaped. He tracked down Methvin's father's farm, and he had a feeling from some sightings that they were heading towards the farm, and he knew what they were driving. Clyde loved Ford, and in fact, there is a rumor, I don't know if it's true, that Clyde even wrote a letter to Henry Ford one time telling him how much he loved Fords, and that Fords were the only cars he was going to steal because he loved them that much. And he wanted Henry Ford to know that he was a true fan, and he was a Ford lover, Ford stealer, Ford driver for life. And so there's a rumor that he actually wrote Henry Ford and told him that. And Bonnie and Clyde they're continuing. They're on their way to Methvin's. They'd already killed the 2 high patrol officers. Then they killed. They murdered a constable who was a widower and a father near Oklahoma. They kidnapped another police chief, and they led him across state lines to Kansas. And they were on their way to Methvin's farm. Frank Hamer had he'd approached Methvin. Methvin agreed to help trap. He helped to be a part of, to not tip Bonnie and Clyde off, to help to be a part in their capture, as long as he got amnesty for his son, so his son wouldn't be sent back to prison. Frank, for 4 days and 4 nights, Frank Hamer had Texas Rangers and highway patrolmen lined and hiding in all of this. Now, this doesn't look exactly like it looked back then, but there was probably a lot more trees back then, right? But they had the officers hiding in the trees along this road that led to the Messman farm. And Frank Hamer got the idea to take Messman Sr.'s truck and to hoist it up in the middle of the road, because he thought to himself that Bonnie and Clyde would probably stop to see if Messman's father needed help. And that's exactly what happened. On the 23rd of May in 1934, Bonnie and Clyde are coming down the road. Hamer sees the car coming. He yells out, "Yes, that's the car." And sure enough, as they get closer, is it true that the gangster's car was faster than the police cars? Yeah, it was. And in fact, there was a couple of things that Bonnie helped Clyde pen the letter to Henry Ford, allegedly, right? And Bonnie said, well, shouldn't we say that another reason you only want to steal steal Fords is because they're faster? And Clyde tells her, hell no, don't tell him that. Because if it gets out, then the cops will start buying Fords and we won't be able to get away. So yeah, their cars were faster than the police cars. Sure enough, just like Hamer had thought, Clyde slows down. He sees Messman's truck and he slows down. And as soon as he slows down, all of the officers that were hiding in the trees, well, there were 6 of them, they opened fire on the car. And one of them says that they heard Bonnie scream. Bonnie and Clyde never got a shot out. It was a total and complete ambush. The officers fired roughly 130 rounds. They emptied their weapons. They emptied every bullet in their weapons into the car. And because they thought Bonnie and Clyde had survived several bullet wounds over the years, they weren't sure that they killed him. They really weren't sure. Bonnie and Clyde had gotten away so many times in gunfire, being shot at, right? The officers really were not sure. And Ted Hinton, do you remember Ted Hinton? He was the Western Union guy who went to work for the post office and then eventually joined the Dallas police force and ended up on the posse that killed Bonnie. He had been one of her regulars at the cafe where she was a waitress just a few years before. This was a statement that was made by Hinton and another officer. Each of us 6 officers had a shotgun, an automatic rifle, and pistols. We opened fire with the automatic rifles. They were emptied before the car even got with us. Then we used shotguns. There was smoke coming from the car and it looked like it was on fire. After shooting the shotguns, we emptied the pistols at the car, which had passed us, and ran into a ditch about 50 yards down the road. It almost turned over. We kept shooting at the car even after it stopped. We weren't taking any chances. There's the 6 officers. When there was some film footage that was taken by one of the deputies right after the ambush, and it showed roughly 112 bullet holes in the vehicle. 112, and about 25% of those bullets hit Bonnie and Clyde. There was over 17 wounds on Clyde's body, including one that had severed his spinal cord. That's him on one side of the car. Bonnie was in the passenger seat. You can see in this picture, that's her, and she's leaned against Clyde. Bonnie had 26 bullet wounds on her body. And one of the officers later said in a statement that they wished they could have taken them alive. There was no way to take them alive. They could never have risked either one of them getting a hold of a gun. And that they really, Frank Hamer in particular said that he felt really sickened when he saw Bonnie's body. That it made him sick that he had to kill a woman, but that he had no doubt that if they hadn't killed Bonnie, they would be dead. This is a color. Somebody has gone back and colorized this picture. Again, you can see Bonnie in there. Word of this got out, and I'm telling you, people descended on this site. They were trying to take memorabilia away from this. They were ripping at clothes. Frank Hamer said he walked up and there was a guy trying to cut Clyde's trigger finger off as a souvenir. So they got them out of there as quickly as they could. That's Bonnie's body at the coroners or the undertakers. And this is Clyde. This is, these are two plaques that are set up on the side of that road. This is the exact ambush site of Bonnie and Clyde. So if you go to Louisiana, you can see that today. The only thing that Bonnie and Clyde had ever wanted was to be buried side by side, but Bonnie's family wasn't having it. Clyde was buried first, and a huge amount of people showed up to his funeral. They almost couldn't get the car through the road to bury him. Bonnie's family had wanted her taken back home to be buried, but there was no way to get her body there. So she was buried 3 days later across town. And her tombstone says, Bonnie Parker, October 1st, 1910 to May 23rd, 1934. She was 24 years old. As the flowers are all made sweeter by the sunshine and the dew, so this old world is made brighter by the lives of, can't read what it says there. Oh, I bet you it says lives of folks like you. And Clyde was actually buried under one tombstone right next to his brother Buck. And Clyde, the bottom, so it's got Clyde on one side and Buck on the other. And on the bottom it says, gone but not forgotten. So it's a little better picture of Bonnie leaned up against Clyde right after the shootout. Now, the car, Bonnie and Clyde's car. Bonnie and Clyde's car went on the road again. It went to county fairs and things like that. You could for $1, you could sit in it and have your picture taken. And eventually, it ended up in Nevada at a casino Um, I don't know why the name is escaping me right now, because it was a really cool name. I want to say it was like Whiskey Pete. Whiskey Pete. Is that it? It was purchased in 1988. It was purchased. A casino near Las Vegas purchased it for about $250,000. And the car and the shirt that Clyde was wearing were displayed behind a glass panel at the Prim Valley Resort and Casino. And this is along Interstate 15. I then want to say that it was purchased by like Whiskey Pete Saloon, but I don't know why I can't remember that. And this is actually allegedly an excerpt from there's the car again. This is an excerpt from a letter that he wrote, that Clyde wrote, April 10th, 1934, so just about 6 weeks before he and Bonnie were killed, that he wrote to Henry Ford. While I still have breath in my lungs, I will tell you what a dandy car you make. I have drove Fords exclusively where I could get away with one. For sustained speed and freedom from the trouble, the Ford has got every other car skinned. And even if my business hasn't been strictly legal, it don't hurt anything to tell you what a fine car you got in the V8. But I am going to give a disclaimer to that, to say that there have been some doubts about the authenticity of that letter. But it sounds like something old Clyde might say, right? There's the car. Look at that. And this is a poem that was found in the Joplin, Missouri hideout that Bonnie had written. And it kind of foretells what she might have known was coming for her and Clyde. The Ballad of Bonnie and Clyde. They don't think they're too tough or desperate. They know that the law always wins. They've been shot at before, but they do not ignore that death is the wages of sin. Someday they'll go down together, and they'll bury them side by side. To few it'll be grief, to the law a relief, but it's death for Bonnie and Clyde. Bonnie Parker, 1934. That's it. That's the story of Bonnie and Clyde. So, I called this case, the Mayhem of Bonnie and Clyde, True Love or Pure Evil. What do you guys think? I think it was both. I think that that's what looks like when pure evil falls in love. I truly, truly, truly do. Trish, you asked how many victims that they had. Rylan, there's a really good one on YouTube, actually, called Bonnie and Clyde, and it's a good one, and it's free on YouTube. It's really good. So their victims, we always want to remember the victims. Bonnie and Clyde killed 12 people during 2 years. They were only together 2 years, you guys. 2 years. From February 1932 to May of 1934, they killed 12 people. They killed John Napoleon Butcher of Hillsborough. He was the shop owner, remember? That was in 1932. They killed Deputy Eugene Capel of Oklahoma in 1932. 2 victims. Howard Hall of Sherman, Texas, October 11, 1932. Doyle Alley Myers Johnson of Temple, Texas, murdered December 26, 1932. Deputy Malcolm Simmons of Dallas, Texas, January 6, 1933. Detective Harry Leonard McGinnis of Joplin, Missouri, murdered 1933. Constable John Wesley West Harriman of Joplin, Missouri, killed 1933. Town Marshal Henry Davis Dallas Humphrey, Arkansas, murdered June 26, 1933. Prison guard Mayor Joseph Crownson of Huntsville, Texas, murdered 1934. Patrolman Edward Brian Ed Wheeler of Grapevine, Texas, murdered April 1st, 1934. Patrolman Holloway Daniel H.D. Murphy of Grapevine, Texas, murdered April 1st, 1934. And Constable William Calvin Cal Campbell of Oklahoma, murdered April 6, 1934. That's it. The story of Bonnie and Clyde. Thank you for joining me, you guys. I hope you found it interesting. Go look for that movie on YouTube, Ronnie. Just put in, movie. There's one you can rent, but there's another one that's free. And if I can, I'll find you the link and send it to you because it was really, really, really good. They were kids. Michaela said children of their age who went down the wrong way. They were kids, 24 and 25. Just like I said, blew my mind when I figured that out. Listen, thanks for joining me. That was a big case. There was a lot of players in that case, right? We had guys escaping from prison and going to prison, and family members, and the Bonnie's over here, and then her husband's over here. And I remember, she never divorced that first husband of hers. So Bonnie and Clyde were never married. Right? Some people think that they were never married. She was wearing a wedding ring the day that they died, but that was her wedding ring to Thornton, who he was in prison still when he got word that she died, and then he himself was shot and killed 5 years later trying to escape. So that was a wild bunch. That was a wild time, I'm thinking. But God, they were shockingly young. And I was also surprised that like their murderous rampage, all that craziness, only happened in 2 years. Their legend is so much bigger, that it's so much larger than life, that I think it makes them seem like they were older and that it went on for a much longer time. But like I said, I think they were evil. And Michaela says pure evil. I think that's what happens when pure evil falls in love. So thank you so much. You guys go find a Bonnie and Clyde movie if you can. Michaela, you might even be able to find it on YouTube yourself. It was really good. I enjoyed it. And thank you for being